Go ahead.
Welcome everyone. Due to the COVID-19 outbreak, we wanted to offer a small miniature tour of our special exhibit, The Holocaust by Bullets, before we have to close our doors this afternoon. So today I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to the exhibit so that when we're back open, hopefully by April 20th, you'll be able to know what we have in store for you here when you visit the museum. This exhibit is created by an organization called which means together in one, in Hebrew and Latin. This organization was founded by Father Patrick Dubois, a French Catholic priest, in 2004. In the more than 15 years since they've been operating, Yehad Hanunam has conducted almost 3,000 investigations into different sites across Europe, as you see on the map there, of mass shootings in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust by bullets, as it's called. This phase of the Holocaust is often not remembered, and so this exhibit offers an opportunity for us to learn about Holocaust history in a different place and a different way that genocide was perpetrated during World War II. Here, we're not looking at concentration camps or ghettos. We're looking at mass shootings that took place in broad daylight, in full view and in full knowledge of neighbors and witnesses. Today, through this exhibit, we'll learn from the witnesses, those who were forced, those who were curious, those who were requisitioned to work, and others, about what they saw during these years of the Holocaust. In this exhibit, we're looking specifically at 1941 to 1944, when the Einsatzgruppen, or Nazi special squads, were moving across Eastern Europe after the invasion of the Soviet Union. These mass shootings claimed the lives of at least 2 million Jewish people and other minorities. That's 1/3 of all the victims of the Holocaust who were murdered in this Holocaust by bullets. Father Dubois and his organization have broken down this crime into 5 steps. So I'll invite you to follow me. We'll go around to the back of this first panel and look at the way the exhibit has broken down these 5 steps of the crime of genocide in Eastern Europe during the Holocaust by bullets. We begin with the arrest. Many people ask, why did Jewish communities agree to go? Why did they show up at these points of arrest? How could they allow this to happen? There's a myth that we call like sheep to slaughter. Here we have wonderful evidence to help us refute that myth. It simply isn't true. We've come to understand through the research, uncovering these sites and learning more about the genocide committed in Eastern Europe, that there was always a ruse in place that would help bring Jewish communities to a point of arrest, typically through language that indicated they would be brought to a site for relocation. Okay? From there, once the communities are brought to a central location, they are walked typically down a very commonly used road, right often from the center of town near a train station, into a forest, a field, a ravine, some natural site that would lend itself to being a place of mass graves and mass execution in broad view of the town and the villagers. The victims were forced to walk from that central meeting point to the site of execution, and so this step of walking them along the road out to that site was a central feature that many of the witnesses highlighted in their testimony about this history. From the road, once victims are brought to the mass execution site, they are forced to undress and leave all of their belongings in a central location. This is a very difficult part of the crime to speak about because it represents humanity at its most vulnerable. Now, there were 2 reasons for the undressing that we'll speak about once we get to that panel in the exhibit. Once the victims had been forced to undress, they were then taken to the site of the mass graves and were shot, often by the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi perpetrators, or local collaborators. The final stage of the crime is the looting. Here we see in this photograph the amazing amount of locals' possessions, their belongings, the food that they brought with them, the clothing that they were wearing. These things were left behind and they were looted or stolen by the Nazi perpetrators and by local collaborators. Now, in this special exhibit, each of these 5 steps of the crime is highlighted by these 5 triangular panels here in our exhibit space. As you can see, each of the triangular panels has large-scale photographs on the outside, and those are accompanied by interior panels inside these cutouts and boxes. These inside are archival photographs taken at the dates and times of the executions. Here we have a photograph of Father Patrick Dubois at one of the former ghetto sites. And on the interior of this panel, this first panel, which highlights the arrest, we can see on the interior, it's a little difficult to see in video, but you see in Ukrainian and Russian a notice that was placed in the village of Lubny in Ukraine in October of 1941. This is very shortly after the invasion of the Soviet Union that summer. The notice reads, "All Jews residing in the city of Lubny must report on the 16th of October, 1941, at 9 o'clock in the morning to 3 Zamostia Street. It is essential to provide food for 3 days and warm clothing. Those who do not comply with this order will be shot. Whoever trespasses into the closed Jewish apartments or engages in the looting of these apartments will be shot. Aryan residents, Russians and Ukrainians, are called to denounce Jews who do not comply with this order." So here we see that archival evidence that there was always a ruse or a trick to get local Jewish populations to come to the point of arrest, to assure them that they were simply being taken for resettlement. From that arrest point, we move down to look at the archival panel on the road. What's very striking about this phase of the crime is, again, that it was conducted in broad daylight. Witnesses who saw what happened in the 1940s and who continue to live in these communities today are able to take researchers from Father Dubois' teams back to these sites easily because they remain essentially unchanged since the years of the perpetration of these crimes. You see here a gentleman pointing along to show the very road that the victims were walked down to the site of execution. It looks exactly the same as it did in 1941-42. It has not been paved, there is no electricity, there are no power lines, nothing to indicate any change in time over the course of more than 75 years since the genocide was committed. The road also provided an opportunity for local witnesses of all different types to see what the Nazis were doing as they moved into their communities once they conquered that territory on their way east. The road really represents a place where victims saw their friends, neighbors, and colleagues for the last time as they were walked away from their villages and communities. We can also recognize that for these witnesses, this was the last time they saw their friends, colleagues, and classmates as they walked on their way to the execution sites. From there, we come to the third panel in the exhibit, which describes what happens when the victims arrived at the mass shooting sites. Testimony from witnesses, typically those who were requisitioned or forced by the Nazis to come and work at these sites, give us a good understanding of what happened when the victims arrived to these sites. Archival photographs show us just how much was left in terms of people's clothing, their belongings, the food that they packed and left behind. Witnesses like Mikhail, who was born in 1928, and Uliana, who was born in 1925, putting them in their late teenage and early 20s years when these crimes were taking place. They gave testimony that helps us understand what happened. Mikhail remarked that the Jews walked in groups of 6, holding hands, indicating that they came with their families and stayed together as long as they could through this process, these final moments of their lives. The undressing really served 2 purposes from the perpetrator's perspective. The first was to dehumanize the victims, to embarrass them, And the second was to facilitate the last step of the crime, which, as we learned from the introductory panel, is the looting. Once the victims had been forced to undress, we come to the panel that describes the shooting themselves. This history is incredibly difficult to confront and truly makes us aware that we are coming into this history with an understanding that we are witnessing the very last moments of these victims' lives. We have to have an honor and a dignity and a respect for the photographs and the testimony that details these moments. It is incredibly important for us to approach this subject with great respect. And as you look at the pictures of these witnesses, many of whom were forced to watch these mass shootings, we can understand that they too experienced the pain and lingering trauma from having witnessed, again, their friends, colleagues, and classmates being murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators in broad daylight during the genocide. We look at their faces and we remember that they are helping us preserve this history for generations to come so that we can honor the memory of those who lost their lives in the senseless pursuit of race and space, as the Nazis put it. And we can make sure that we know what genocide looks like in all its many forms, not only in concentration and death camps, but in mass shooting operations, which persist to this day. From this phase of the crime, we go on to the last panel in the exhibit, which details the final step of the crime, the looting. After the victims had been murdered and buried in mass graves unmarked, the witnesses and oftentimes local collaborators were forced to bring back the possessions, including the clothing and food left behind by these victims. They were brought to a central meeting point in the village, typically a church, a school, a civic gathering point, so that they could be sorted. The Nazi perpetrators would take what they wished first, and then either leave or sell the rest of the looted goods to local collaborators and leaders. From there, sometimes even the poorest members of these communities would take from these looted goods. And this is something that is very uncomfortable to confront. In this testimony for women like Aniceta and Elisabetta, who were born in 1931 and 1918 respectively, we can understand how uncomfortable it must have been to live in the aftermath of these crimes. Due to the poverty in many of these small villages, we see Aniceta say, the children of the shooters came to school dressed in Jewish clothes. The gunmen entered Jewish houses to take their belongings, right? But we also see testimony like down here, where it says, you can't even imagine our childhoods in those days. We were very poor. Shoes were a real luxury back then. My classmates were dressed in Jewish clothes. Unbelievable. The way that the personal belongings, the intimacy of wearing someone else's clothes, right? Victims of genocide, their memories stayed in these communities in very present ways due to the nefarious looting of their belongings by the perpetrators and collaborators. This is complicated history, and no part of it makes us feel comfortable. No part of it has a happy ending, unfortunately. But what this exhibit and what our work here at the Holocaust Museum aims to do is to educate all of us about genocide, again, in these different forms, in these different places in Eastern Europe that perhaps we never knew about. Though it's difficult to confront this history, it leaves us feeling uncomfortable, feeling sad or depressed, feeling frustrated and angry that we didn't know about this history and what the perpetrators and collaborators did locally. However, we know that the more we know about genocide, the more we know about histories of violence, the better equipped we are to deal with violence and genocide today. It's our sincere hope that exhibits like this, the educational programs that we run at the museum and the resources that we provide, help educate us about violence done in the past so that we can work to prevent it in the future. We hope today that this miniature tour of our special exhibit gave you a hint about this incredible work being done to preserve memory, to preserve history, and to educate us on the dangers of standing by and of not taking action before genocide escalates to a point where we have no possibility to stop it, as with these witnesses, as with the victims in Eastern Europe. Thank you for joining us today on this digital tour, and we hope to see you in the museum soon when we reopen after the threat of this outbreak diminishes to our community. Take care, continue in learning about history, and don't hesitate to reach out if we can provide you with any more information or context about this exhibit or any of the work we do here. Thank you.